Throughout history, certain murders have shocked the world, not only for their brutality but also for the dark mysteries they leave behind. These are not just killings, they are crimes that leave people frozen in fear and desperate for answers. In this video, we explore 6 of the most brutal and violent murders in America during the 20th century. These cases, involving knives, guns, and other weapons, have left deep scars on the nation's psyche and remain haunting to this day. The flicker of a street lamp, the echoes of footsteps on an empty sidewalk, the silence that follows a violent act, these are the eerie remnants of a crime. These are the kinds of crimes we will explore today, murders that defy explanation, murders that terrorized the country and captured the attention of millions. From the roaring 20s, when fear gripped the streets of America's cities, to the final decades of the 20th century, when the world watched in horror as lives were taken in the most brutal ways imaginable, these are the stories of murder that shook America to its core. The people involved, the brutality of the killings, the mystery behind each crime, they have captivated our attention, sparked investigations, and kept us guessing long after the crimes occurred. Some of these cases were solved, criminals were caught, justice was served. But many others remain unresolved, forever etched in the annals of unsolved mysteries. Who were these killers? What drove them to commit such heinous acts? And what happened in the shadows that we will never fully know? In the next few minutes, we will delve into these chilling events. Each story is a reminder that behind every headline, behind every unsolved mystery, there are lives that have been lost, families forever changed, and a sense of justice that eludes many. These cases are not just about the murders themselves, but about the people who lived through them, the investigators, the witnesses, the victims, and the families who were left behind. Some cases remain cold to this day. Others have left behind nothing but questions and scars, with no answers to bring closure. These are not just murder cases, they are the untold stories that still haunt us. Let's dive in. The most brutal murders in America, stories you've never heard, or at least, not in their entirety. Stories that have stayed with us, unfinished, unresolved, forever. Among the most brutal and haunting murders in American history is the infamous case of Elizabeth Short, known as the Black Dahlia. In 1947, the body of 22-year-old Elizabeth Short was found in a vacant lot in Los Angeles. Her body was mutilated beyond recognition, with her torso severed in half and her face slashed into a grotesque smile. The brutality of the crime shocked the nation, leaving a mark on Los Angeles and the entire country. Elizabeth Short was an aspiring actress, a woman chasing the American dream. But what she didn't know was that her life would come to an end in the most gruesome and horrifying manner imaginable. Short's tragic fate unfolded in the heart of Hollywood, a city known for both its glamour and darkness. Her body was found early in the morning on January 15, 1947, by a woman walking with her child. The discovery sent shockwaves through the city. But even more disturbing was the fact that the killer had taken great care to display the body. Her body was cut in half, the blood drained, and her face grotesquely slashed into a smile. Despite the brutality of the crime, no signs of struggle were found. It was as if the killer had complete control over the scene. Authorities were left baffled. This was no ordinary murder. The killer seemed to have known exactly what they were doing, leaving behind few clues, yet sending cryptic messages to the police and the press. The killer taunted the police and the media with letters. Some of the letters included cryptic ciphers that, to this day, remain unsolved. The eerie tone of the letters, mixed with the horrific nature of the crime, made the Black Dahlia case an enduring mystery that captured the public's imagination. Over the years, there were many suspects, including doctors, actors, and even a man who claimed to be the killer. but despite hundreds of leads and years of investigation, no one was ever charged with the murder of Elizabeth Short. The case remains one of the most famous unsolved murders in American history. The Black Dahlia case is not just about a brutal murder, it's about a city, a society, and a time. It's about how the public, the media, and the authorities tried to make sense of a senseless crime. Elizabeth Short's life and death became part of Hollywood lore, and though her killer was never found, her legacy remains forever tied to the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of fame and fortune. To this day, Elizabeth Short's murder remains unsolved, a chilling reminder of how one woman's life was taken in the most brutal way. The mystery continues to haunt Los Angeles, and the search for the truth remains elusive. But the Black Dahlia case serves as a dark chapter in the history of a city and a reminder that sometimes, even the most brutal crimes can slip through the cracks of justice. June 10, 1912, was just another summer evening in the small town of Villisca, Iowa, a quiet farming community where everyone knew each other. But that night, the quiet was shattered by an unimaginable act of violence. In the Moore family home, 6 members of the family and 2 young house guests were brutally murdered while they slept. The weapon? An axe used with such terrifying precision, it would become one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history. The victims were Josiah Moore, his wife Sarah, their 4 children, and 2 young friends who were visiting for the night. The murderer entered the home while the family slept, methodically killing each member, including the children. The method of the crime was as brutal as it was chilling. The killer used an axe, striking each victim in their sleep, before covering their faces with sheets and making his escape into the night. The scene was horrific. Blood was splattered across the walls and furniture, and the killer took great care to leave behind an unsettling and ritualistic display. The mirrors in the house were covered, and the killer left the axe behind, still stained with the victim's blood. The police were stumped. The killer had left no clues, no fingerprints, no footprints, and no signs of forced entry. There were no witnesses, and despite the gruesome nature of the crime, no obvious motive. Was it a random act of violence, or did the killer have a personal vendetta against the family? The small town of Villisca was left in shock, its quiet streets now tinged with fear. Despite the bizarre nature of the crime, rumors began to circulate. Some believed the murders were connected to a local preacher, Reverend George Kelly, who had been in the area at the time. Others suspected the involvement of a traveling murderer, someone who had committed similar acts in other towns across the country. But no clear evidence ever emerged. The investigation was extensive, but the killer slipped through the cracks. Over the years, several suspects have been named, including Reverend Kelly, but no one was ever formally charged. Some even believed that the killer was a drifter passing through, committing these violent acts before vanishing into the night. But no matter how many theories were presented, the truth of what happened that night in Villisca has remained elusive. Though the case went cold, the Villisca axe murders have never been forgotten. They became part of the town's folklore, and to this day, the Moore House stands as a grim reminder of that violent night. For the people of Villisca, and for those who have heard the story, the murder of 8 innocent people remains an unsolved mystery that continues to haunt. The identity of the killer, and the reasons behind the brutal murders, remain a dark chapter in the history of Villisca. The killer may never be found, but the legacy of that night, the terror, the bloodshed, and the unanswered questions continues to cast a shadow over the town. The victims, forever young and innocent, have left behind a haunting story that will never be fully resolved. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Northern California became the hunting ground for one of the most infamous and feared serial killers in American history, known only as the Zodiac Killer. His identity has never been confirmed, and his brutal crimes were tainted by an air of chilling mystery. But it wasn't just the murders that made him notorious, it was the way he toyed with the media and law enforcement, leaving cryptic messages and taunting the authorities who were desperately trying to catch him. The Zodiac Killer's reign of terror began in 1968, when he murdered two teenagers, Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, near a remote road in Vallejo, California. It seemed like an isolated act of violence. But in December of that year, he struck again, this time killing Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau. They were parked at a lover's lane in a secluded area when the killer approached them. The brutality of the murders was chilling. Each victim was shot at point-blank range. At first, there was little to go on. But then, the killer made a bold move that would forever change the nature of this case. In 1969, the Zodiac began sending cryptic letters to local newspapers, boasting of his murders and taunting the police. These letters were filled with disturbing details and ciphers, some of which still have not been solved to this day. His cryptic messages seemed to mock the investigators, as if he knew they were powerless to stop him. The Zodiac's taunts were not limited to letters. He would often call into radio shows, giving chillingly cryptic statements, but never revealing his identity. His calls, calm, almost emotionless, added to the growing fear. The public was terrorized by the idea that someone could be lurking in plain sight, living among them without anyone knowing who he was. The Zodiac's crimes were brutal, but it was his ability to evade capture, time after time, that made him a legend in the world of criminal history. He would strike, leave his cryptic marks, and vanish into the night, only to reappear months later with another letter or another crime. In 1970, the Zodiac claimed to have killed 37 people, though he was only linked to 5 confirmed murders. His most infamous attack came in July 1969, when he killed Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Ann Shepard at Lake Berryessa. He approached the couple while they were enjoying a peaceful afternoon, tied them up, and then attacked them with a knife. After stabbing the couple, the Zodiac took Hartnell's car keys and wrote a message on Hartnell's car door, a message that would become a trademark of his crimes. It read, "I am the Zodiac." But even after this attack, the killer managed to escape, leaving law enforcement frustrated and desperate for answers. The Zodiac's killing slowed down after 1970, and despite several attempts by the police to capture him, his identity remained a mystery. In 1974, the Zodiac ceased his communication altogether, and no new murders were linked to him. The case went cold. Over the years, many suspects were proposed, but none were ever definitively tied to the crimes. The last known Zodiac letter was sent in 1974, but even now, decades later, his identity remains a mystery. The case was never closed, and new generations of detectives and amateur sleuths continue to try and solve it. With advances in DNA and forensic technology, there is hope that one day, the truth will finally be uncovered. But for now, the Zodiac Killer remains an elusive figure, one of the most chilling, uncatchable criminals in American history. The Zodiac Killer's story is far from over. In fact, it may never truly end until his identity is revealed. For now, the mystery continues to haunt the streets of Northern California, and the search for justice remains unsatisfied. The 1960s were marked by a series of chilling murders that terrorized the city of Boston. The Boston Strangler, a figure shrouded in mystery, is believed to have been responsible for the deaths of at least 13 women. The method of his killings was disturbingly simple. He strangled his victims, often using their own stockings, and left their bodies in their apartments. But what made this case even more chilling was the fact that for years, no one knew who the killer was. The city's sense of security was shattered, and the fear of the Strangler seemed to grow with every passing day. The Strangler's first confirmed victim, Anna Sleezers, was found in her Boston apartment in June 1962. She had been strangled with her own nylon stockings, her body left in a tragic state of disarray. Over the next 2 years, the killer would target women in their homes, always striking in similar fashion. Each time, the women were found strangled, and the brutality of the crime seemed to escalate. The Strangler's presence loomed over the city like a shadow, always close, but never seen. The victims were not random, they were women living alone, many of whom were older, and some were even involved in the same community. This pattern gave investigators little to go on. The killer's methodical approach, choosing his victims based on vulnerability, made him even more terrifying. He knew exactly how to strike, and his ability to evade the police added to the mounting fear throughout the city. The investigation was intense, but no real breakthroughs emerged. The city was paralyzed by fear, and the authorities were left chasing leads that went nowhere. But despite all the investigations and public outcry, the Boston Strangler was always just one step ahead until a man named Albert DeSalvo came into the picture. DeSalvo was a man with a criminal background, but not the obvious choice for a murderer. He was caught in 1964 after confessing to a string of other crimes, including sexual assaults. However, it wasn't until later that he would claim to be the Boston Strangler. He gave detailed confessions about the killings, describing the victims and the crime scenes, but his story was filled with inconsistencies. He even provided details that were known only to the killer. Despite his confessions, there were doubts. Some investigators believed that DeSalvo's confessions were a result of coercion, while others thought he might have been claiming responsibility for crimes he hadn't committed. His confessions, though chilling, were too ambiguous to be definitive. He was convicted of unrelated crimes and sentenced to life in prison. But the question remained: was Albert DeSalvo the Boston Strangler? Was he the man behind the 13 brutal murders, or was there another killer out there? In 1973, DeSalvo was stabbed to death in prison, and the case of the Boston Strangler remained officially unsolved. Despite advances in forensic science, and DNA testing being introduced in the late 20th century, the truth about the Strangler's identity has never been conclusively determined. Was DeSalvo the killer, or did the real Strangler die or disappear into obscurity? To this day, the murders of those 13 women remain an open wound in Boston's history. The mystery of the Boston Strangler continues to haunt the city. Though DeSalvo is the most commonly associated name with the crimes, there is still uncertainty surrounding the case. Did justice ever truly find the right man? Or did the Strangler remain free, even as time continued to march on? From 1979 to 1981, the city of Atlanta was paralyzed by a series of brutal murders that claimed the lives of at least 28 children, teenagers, and young adults. The victims, predominantly African American, were found in various locations across the city. Some were strangled, others were shot. The killings seemed random at first, but as the body count grew, so did the fear that something far more sinister was at work. What followed was a harrowing investigation that spanned years, leaving a city in fear and a community demanding justice. At first, the murders seemed unconnected, isolated incidents, tragic but seemingly random. But as more bodies were found, the patterns became undeniable. Many of the victims were last seen walking alone, or were abducted while in public areas. All were young, and most were children or teenagers. The fear was palpable as parents kept their children close, afraid that the next victim could be someone they loved. The police were initially stumped by the lack of clear evidence and the varying nature of the killings. The city was gripped by fear, and rumors swirled that a serial killer was lurking in their midst. As the murders continued, the media began referring to the killer as the Atlanta child killer, a nameless figure who seemed to strike with no pattern, no rhyme, and no reason. The investigation was chaotic, and many questioned whether the authorities could stop the killer before more innocent lives were lost. Amidst the growing panic, the police turned to various suspects, and soon, one name began to rise to the surface: Wayne Williams. Williams, a 23-year-old man, had been seen near the scenes of some of the murders. He was a local figure, a small-time hustler and part-time photographer, whose presence in the city had caught the attention of investigators. But it wasn't until the murder of two adult victims, Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne, that the police began to focus their investigation squarely on him. In June 1981, Williams was arrested on charges related to the murders of the two adults. While the police did not have enough evidence to directly link him to all of the child murders, they were confident that Williams was involved. The case against him was circumstantial, based largely on witness testimony, forensic evidence from fiber samples found on the bodies, and Williams' strange behavior during the investigation. Williams was tried for the murders of two adult victims, and in 1982, he was convicted of their deaths and sentenced to life in prison. However, despite his conviction, the question remained: was he the killer of all the children? Many believed that there were still other killers out there, and that Wayne Williams might have been just one part of a larger, more complex story. Williams has always maintained his innocence, insisting that he was framed, but the evidence seemed to tell another story. Wayne Williams was convicted, but the full extent of the Atlanta child murders remains a mystery. Some investigators and experts continue to question whether all of the murders were committed by Williams alone, while others maintain that the case is closed. In 2005, DNA evidence linked Williams to two of the earlier child murders, but his involvement in the others remains unproven. Wayne Williams was The story of the Atlanta child murders is not just about a string of killings, it's about a city grappling with terror, with the loss of its youngest, most innocent members. It's about the question of justice, the chilling reality of a community in fear, and the uncertainty of whether the right person was ever truly held accountable for the deaths of those children. On the night of June 12, 1994, the world watched as a brutal and senseless murder took place in the heart of Los Angeles. Nicole Brown Simpson, the ex-wife of former football star O.J. Simpson, and her friend, Ron Goldman, were brutally murdered outside Nicole's home. The manner in which they were killed, slashed repeatedly with a knife, was as brutal as it was chilling. What followed was a high-profile case that captivated the world, with a level of media frenzy and public attention that was unprecedented. Nicole and Ron were found lying lifeless outside Nicole's condominium in Brentwood, California. Ron was found collapsed near the gate, his throat slashed, and Nicole's body was discovered just a few feet away. The brutality of the killings was evident in the multiple stab wounds, and there was no sign of a struggle. It was clear that the killer knew what they were doing. At first, the police had few leads. But suspicion quickly turned to O.J. Simpson, Nicole's former husband, who had been estranged from her for several years. Simpson was a famous football star, an actor, and a public figure. The murder of his ex-wife and her friend became a media spectacle, and the spotlight was focused squarely on him. Simpson's history of domestic violence added a chilling context to the case. As police moved quickly to gather evidence, O.J. Simpson's dramatic car chase became a spectacle for millions across the world. On June 17, Simpson, in a white Ford Bronco, led police on a slow-speed chase through the streets of Los Angeles. The images of Simpson in the backseat of the car, accompanied by his friend Al Cowlings, were broadcast live on TV, making the case even more public and surreal. Simpson's capture, and the media frenzy that followed, added layers of complexity to the case. Public opinion was split. Many believed Simpson was guilty, while others argued that he was the victim of a racist police force looking to bring down a prominent black athlete. The trial, which began in 1995, would become a circus of media attention, with every moment of the courtroom drama broadcast live. The prosecution presented a damning case: blood evidence, DNA samples, and a trail that linked Simpson to the crime scene. But the defense, led by a team of some of the most famous lawyers in America, quickly went to work, attacking the credibility of the evidence. They pointed to possible mistakes made by the police, and they argued that Simpson had been framed. In one of the most memorable moments of the trial, Johnnie Cochran, Simpson's lead attorney, famously said, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit," referring to the gloves found at the crime scene. The defense's strategy worked, and in October 1995, O.J. Simpson was acquitted of all charges. The verdict, delivered by a predominantly African American jury, sparked outrage and joy in equal measure across the nation. For some, it was a victory over a biased system, but for others, it was a travesty of justice. The public was divided, and the case left an indelible mark on the American consciousness. While Simpson was acquitted in the criminal case, in 1997, a civil court found him liable for the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. He was ordered to pay $33.5 million in damages to the victims' families. But the question of his guilt or innocence continues to linger in the public eye. Simpson's case is one of the most controversial in modern history. Was he a guilty man freed by a system that failed, or was he a victim of circumstances and a biased investigation? The O.J. Simpson case remains a haunting chapter in America's criminal history. It serves as a reminder of the complexities of justice, celebrity, and race, and the way in which a single case can consume a nation's attention. The murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, tragic and brutal, remain forever tied to the unresolved questions of the trial. The shadow of O.J. Simpson looms large, and the truth may never fully emerge. As we look back on the stories we've just explored, the brutality of the Black Dahlia, the horrific murders in Villisca, the haunting mystery of the Zodiac Killer, the terror inflicted by the Boston Strangler, the unsolved Atlanta child murders, and the sensational trial of O.J. Simpson, we are reminded of the fragility of life and the shadows that sometimes lurk behind seemingly ordinary people. Each of these cases represents more than just a crime. They are reflections of fear, of community, and of the deep complexities of human nature. The families of the victims, whose lives were shattered in an instant, still carry the weight of these murders. The investigators, who dedicated their lives to solving these mysteries, still search for closure. And society, as a whole, is left to grapple with the moral and ethical questions raised by these brutal events. These murders, though separated by decades, have one thing in common: an unresolved truth. Some killers were caught, while others remain elusive. Some cases led to convictions, while others remain open, a void of unanswered questions. And for every answer we find, there are countless more that remain buried in the shadows, locked away by time and circumstance. Time has a way of changing things, of dulling the edges of a tragedy, but the pain for the victims' families, the unanswered questions, and the mysteries of these crimes remain fresh in our minds. No matter how much time passes, the scars left by these acts of violence linger, reminding us of the darkness that sometimes dwells in the most unexpected places. We may never fully understand why these crimes were committed, or who the true perpetrators were. What we can learn, however, is that these cases serve as a chilling reminder of the complexities of the human mind and the darkness that can sometimes be hidden beneath the surface. The search for justice, for truth, and for peace may never truly end. And sometimes, closure is not something we can find, it's something we must make peace with. These stories are more than just tragic chapters in the history of crime, they are lessons in the fragility of justice, in the strength of human resilience, and in the power of memory. They are reminders that, even in the darkest of times, we must never stop searching for the truth, no matter how elusive it may seem. Thank you for joining us as we explored these haunting cases. The stories of these victims may have ended, but their legacies, and the mysteries surrounding their deaths, remain with us. As we close, we are reminded that justice is not always swift, but it is always worth pursuing. Until next time, remember, sometimes the darkest stories are the ones we have yet to fully understand. As we reach the end of our journey through these brutal and haunting cases, we are left with more questions than answers. The names of the victims, their faces, their stories, they will never be forgotten. But the killers, the perpetrators of such senseless violence, remain hidden in the shadows, their identities still a mystery to the world. For some, justice has been served, but for many, it remains an unfulfilled promise, lingering in the air like a broken thread. In the end, these stories are more than just tales of violence, they are a reflection of our society, our justice system, and the human condition. They remind us of the darkness that exists in the world, but also of the resilience of those who continue to seek answers, to search for truth, even when it seems impossible to find. Though the killers in some of these cases were brought to justice, there are others who walk free, their identities still concealed by the passage of time. And while we may never know the full truth behind these brutal acts, we must remember the victims, the lives that were stolen, the families that were shattered, and the communities that were forever changed. Each case we've explored today leaves behind a legacy, not just of the crimes themselves, but of the hope for justice. The search for answers never truly ends. It may take years, even decades, but the desire for truth is something that cannot be extinguished. And as long as we remember these stories, as long as we seek justice, we honor the memory of those who were lost. Though some mysteries may remain unsolved, they are never forgotten. We must continue to ask the hard questions, to seek the truth, and to honor the victims whose lives were taken far too soon. In a world full of uncertainty, it is our shared pursuit of justice that binds us together, even in the face of darkness. Thank you for watching and reflecting with us today. We may never know all the answers, but we must never stop searching for the truth. Until next time, remember, the story is never over, and justice, though sometimes delayed, is always worth seeking.